Welcome back to the channel and to our Volkswagen diesel-powered Chevy S10 project. Under the hood of this vintage Chevy, we have a 1.6-liter normally aspirated diesel engine that was formerly installed in a 1985 Volkswagen Golf. The truck was finished a few weeks ago, and it goes down the road pretty good, but we've had some problems sorting things out. Now, the latest problem is the engine loses oil pressure at idle once it warms up, which is not good. So once again, we yanked the engine out, and today we're going to attempt to correct the low oil pressure issue at idle. As I recall, this engine has between 150 and 160,000 miles on it, and the problem may actually be as simple as replacing the intermediate shaft bearings and possibly the oil pump. It'll be interesting to see what we find once we dig into this engine. So stick around, we have a mechanical adventure in store for you today. So this is a mock-up of all the components that drive the oil pump, and for reference, the oil pump's right here. This guy is the intermediate shaft, and it's driven by the pulley which rides on the back side of the timing belt. Anyway, at the end of the shaft is a gear, and that gear engages with the vacuum pump. And on the bottom of the vacuum pump there's a slot, and the oil pump shaft engages into that. And that's what causes the oil pump to spin. So right away, the first thing to note is the vacuum pump must be in place in order for the oil pump to work. Running the engine without the vacuum pump is the same as running the engine without an oil pump. Now this journal on the intermediate shaft gets fed oil directly from the output of the oil pump. If the bearing for this part of the shaft is worn out, then pretty much all the oil will get past this bearing and the engine will suffer from low oil pressure. This part of the shaft gets oil from a convoluted path and not directly from the oil pump, so keep that in mind. So the theory is, we may have a worn out bearing right here, and of course if this bearing's bad, then the other one may be bad too. The alternative reason for low oil pressure is, the oil pump may have a sticky pressure regulator, or the pump is worn out, or the pump is one of those early ones that are undersized. Of course, we could have problems with the main bearings and the rod bearings. Some people have speculated that the modified oil pan may be causing our problem, and I can't rule that out yet. But keep in mind we have low oil pressure at idle, and for the oil pan to be a problem, I would expect good oil pressure at idle and a loss of oil pressure when the engine's at higher speeds. So the pan theory conflicts with our observations, and we won't focus on it today. Okay, let's pull the oil pan and have a look at the pump and the IMS bearings. That should be all the bolts holding the pan in place. Now we need Blue Junior. If you know, you know. Oop, it popped right off. So this oil pan was washed many times after it was modified, and there shouldn't be any debris in it. Well, I don't feel any gritty stuff, so that's good news. Now, according to the service manual, this engine may have been built with an undersized oil pump. I reckon the smaller pump would have worked fine when the engine was new, but as the miles accumulated, the pump may no longer be able to maintain sufficient oil pressure when the engine is idling. Now, according to the Bentley manual, this bit of trivia only applies to engines built in 1985, and this engine was built in 85. It makes me wonder what's the deal with engines built before 85. Okay, we have the oil pump out, let's have a look at it. Off camera, I disassembled the pump so we can have a better look at the gizzards. The O-ring for the pickup tube appears to be in excellent condition. It's nice and flexible, and it doesn't have any obvious damage, so this is likely not the problem. The pickup tube is custom made, and the welds appear to be holding up just fine. The splice right here was done using an interference fit tube on the inside, and both halves of this pipe were welded to that tube. This is a reinforced joint, and of course this part was completely cleaned out after it was welded. Just for fun, I leak tested it again with acetone, and it has no problem holding the liquid, so the welds on this guy are not our problem. I also checked the screen for any debris that may have been restricting the flow, and this area is as clean as it gets, so this thingy is not our problem. Now this part is interesting. You can see a shadow of one of the pump gears that has been etched onto the surface. My best estimate is this engine's been sitting for about 12 years before it was resurrected, and this may be an artifact from sitting so long. The pressure regulator appears to be in the resting position, and it's impossible to say if it was sticking or somehow causing a problem. In its current position, I would expect full oil pressure. Now, we can't rule this part out, especially after seeing how the gear left a shadow on the other surface, but right now it looks fine. Now, the way this component is built, there's no way to disassemble it any further for a proper inspection. Anyway, the O-ring, the pickup tube, and this regulator get a pass. Let's look at the oil pump itself. Well, it's hard to say if this pump is worn out. Now, there's definitely a bunch of measurements that I can do to check to see if the pump is still in spec, but what I'm interested in is the size of the gears. If this pump has a 25mm gear, then it needs to be updated with a new pump that has a 36mm gear. And it has a 25mm gear. Very interesting. So this means the engine was built in early 1985. If it was built in late 85, it would have a 30mm gear. So this is a snapshot of the Bentley manual on the oil pump topic. It looks like these smaller gears can cause a loss of pressure at idle when the engine gets older. This manual only goes back to 1985, so I don't know what the deal is for stuff built before that. Let's have a look at the gears. Now this is interesting. There are score marks on the tip of some of the teeth, but not on all the teeth. So it's hard to say if this is from debris running through the pump or it's an artifact of sloppy manufacturing. You know, I can't believe the Germans would send something like this out the door. Let's take a look at the new pump, which is definitely not built in Germany, if you know what I mean. The doohickeys spin as they should, and there's no weird marks on the teeth of the gears, so that's good. Now the drive tip on this new pump appears to be in perfect condition, which is in contrast to the tip on the older pump. This guy has been around the block a few times, and no doubt the tip is worn out. It's interesting how this got beat up. There has to be a reason for this, but that's probably a rabbit hole we don't need to go down today. Anyway, the gears on the new pump measure in at about 36mm, which is 10mm longer than the gears on the original pump. The bigger gears means a higher flow rate, and that'll give the pressure regulator something to regulate when the engine's running. So this new pump kinda checks out. It's new and it flows more oil, so that's 2 check marks we can give it, I guess. Let's switch gears for a moment. This is the pulley that drives the intermediate shaft. Now, this is interesting. In a previous video that I published about a month ago, more than one person said it was the wrong pulley, and I'm confused as to why they would say something like that. It's the pulley that came with the engine, and if you look online, all the intermediate shaft pulleys, whether they're for a gasoline engine or a diesel engine, are exactly the same as this one. This is in fact the correct pulley for this engine, and there's no possible way that this is a power steering pump pulley. Now, can I give a little bit of advice to some of the folks? Please don't copy and paste other people's comments. You know, on my end, I can see the comments as they roll in, and when I see 5 similar comments in a row, well, I know someone's cheating and not doing their homework. It's not a big deal. Cheat if you want, it's all the same to me, because any comment is a good comment. But when you cheat, please double check to be 100% sure you're not copying a comment from someone who's not familiar with the topic on hand. And you might actually learn something. Just saying. So this is the pulley, and it's the correct pulley for the engine. Now, there is something wrong with it. You see, the flange on the backside is broken in a few spots. This pulley's always been messed up, but since the engine ran, I pretty much ignored the problem. Now, the timing belt rides on this surface, and actually the belt sort of rides along the good edge of the pulley, so the chips on the other edge don't really matter. I could continue to use this pulley, and that would cause some people's heads to explode. So I picked up a second-hand pulley that's in excellent condition. As you can see, it's the exact same pulley, except it's not broken. Just so we're all on the same page, this is the correct pulley, and I'm replacing it with the correct pulley, but it really doesn't need to be replaced. Alright, so far we've learned that the oil pump is NFG in more ways than one. Let's have a look at the intermediate shaft bearing, more specifically the bearing for this part of the shaft. Oh, by the way, this engine's sitting upside down on the engine stand if that wasn't already obvious. Anyway, this is the IMS bearing on the front of the engine, and this bearing is real easy to inspect and replace if required. You know, in my eyes, this bearing looks to be in perfect condition. Typically, when these bearings fail, they delaminate. However, while this one may have some wear on it, it appears to be hunky-dory, which kind of points to the oil pump being the problem all along. Unless this bearing was recently replaced, the story it's telling me is most likely all the bearings in this engine are probably okay. But of course, that's pure speculation, and measuring it is the only way to be sure. Unfortunately, I don't have the tools to measure this, and my only option is to replace it. So to knock this front bearing out, I'm going to improvise and use this Harbor Freight bearing race and seal driver kit. This kit is something that I already have in stock, and later when I install the new bearings, I can modify one of these thingies on the lathe for a perfect fit. Let's do this. Yep, it's moving. And now I can fish it out. The part number that was stamped on this bearing indicates this is an original type Volkswagen bearing, and my best guess is it's an original bearing that was installed when the engine was new. I based that guess on the fact that this engine still had the 25mm oil pump, and more likely if this was a replacement bearing, the oil pump would have also been replaced. So in order to remove the rear IMS bearing, I first need to remove the vacuum pump. Eventually, I'll need to remove the oil filter adapter in order to line up the new bearing with the oil feed hole. Anyway, next I have to remove the 36mm galley plug from the back side of the engine block. And to do that, I'll use a long section of pipe and knock this thing out from the front side of the engine. This galley plug is actually the same as the core plugs that are used in the cooling system. Unfortunately, the engine stand is actually in the way right now, so I need to temporarily hoist the engine with the cherry picker so I can get a good look at the rear bearing. Now, of the two IMS bearings, this guy is the critical one. It gets its oil fed directly from the oil pump, and a bad bearing here will definitely cause low oil pressure. Meh, this bearing actually looks to be just fine. Now with this pick, I can probe the bearing and it feels like the oil feed hole is perfectly lined up. Now with the oil filter adapter off, we can sort of see how this engine distributes oil. Oil from the pump will come up through this opening and then go through the filter. Then it's fed through these two holes. The larger hole provides most of the lubrication for the engine, and the smaller hole is a direct feed to the rear IMS bearing. Now the manual indicates this feed goes to other places, but I have no idea if that's true. Anyway, when installing the new bearing, this hole has to line up with the hole on the bearing, and that's not easy to do. So this is the Harbor Freight bearing race and seal kit. I went ahead and modified one of the doohickeys on the lathe to help me remove the rear IMS bearing. And I'll also use this tool to install the new IMS bearing. As you can see, the bearing fits this fabricated part perfectly. The rear IMS bearing tool is a robot Cantina part number MEH or MEH, and we sell these things for $2 billion cash in unmarked bills of small denominations. The fee is non-negotiable, and I have a friend on the East Coast who goes by the name of Vinny, and he'll handle all the details. You know, my brother Duke says it's probably cheaper just to buy another engine than to purchase this tool. I don't know, $2 billion is not a lot of money these days, but he may have a point. So, the rear IMS bearing actually looks to be in excellent condition. It's stamped with a VAG part number and it was probably original to the engine. It fits on the shaft really nice, and if I had to guess, I'd say this bearing didn't need to be replaced at all. So, yeah. Anyway, to install the new bearing, I modified the $2 billion tool with a Sharpie. Basically, the oil feed hole on the bearing lines up with this dot, and the line that's scribed on the handle shall point straight up when the bearing is driven into the engine block. This will definitely guarantee that the oil feed hole lines up, or at least that's the theory. So this is basically what I'm going to do and install the rear bearing from the front of the engine. It's easy peasy, but the camera's in the way and I need to do this with absolute precision. So everybody take a deep breath and we'll be right back. And the bearing's in. This shot was almost impossible to get because the camera wants to focus right over here. Anyway, if you look close, the oil hole lines up about halfway, which is good enough in my book. On this oil feed hole, the oil dead ends at the IMS shaft, and despite the hole being 50% blocked, we're not restricting the oil flow to the shaft. So this is as good as it's going to get. Oh, and the groove on the bearing wants to point towards the rear of the engine, so at least I got that right. Now, to install the front IMS bearing, I modified the tool a little bit by wrapping it with $6,000 worth of masking tape. The tape is necessary because the inside diameter of this bearing is slightly larger than the rear bearing, and although expensive, the tape helps make up the difference in size. Anyway, it's best to sort of line up the hole by pressing the bearing up against the block and then drive it in with the tool. And the bearing's in, which is nice, and as a bonus, the oil holes line up. Not too shabby. Now let's try to install the shaft to make sure it doesn't bind. I'm doing this dry, but I will use assembly lube when I button this engine up later. The shaft spins nice and there's absolutely no binding. Well, I think we successfully replaced the good IMS bearings with a set of good IMS bearings. Let's recap. The oil pump is NFG for more reasons than one. First of all, it was old and it had a bad doohickey. Plus, it was the smaller 25mm type. The suspected IMS bearings actually turned out to be just fine, but they were replaced anyway. Now, according to the Volkswagen people, the IMS bearings should be replaced as a maintenance item whenever the engine's removed from the car, so it really wasn't a wasted effort. Now, let's talk about cost. The 36mm oil pump was $99, the bearings were $29, the galley plug was $3, and the new oil pan was another $30. The custom tools cost $2,006,000. Now, I've heard that a low-cost cam bearing tool also works if you want to save the $2 billion, but you may have to use masking tape to adjust the size of the tool. I don't know how all that works, and I just used what I had. Fast forward and the engine's back together. The oil pump was packed with assembly lube, and of course the bearings were given a coat of assembly lube. Now, I'm sure some of you will notice that I didn't check the rod or the main bearings. And the thing is, if I checked them, well, I might as well replace them. And that wasn't the point of this repair. The original diagnostic was this engine had worn IMS bearings, and that proved to be completely wrong as far as I could tell. I also speculated that the oil pump may have been at fault due to this engine being built in 1985. It turns out while the IMS bearings were likely good, the oil pump was definitely suspect due to it having the smaller gears. Sure, as a whole, probably the mains and the rod bearings are worn and could use a quick refresh. But let's see what the difference the oil pump makes before completely rebuilding this engine. It's a rare opportunity to see the outcome of a targeted repair. The next step is installing the timing belt, which is pretty much straightforward when following the Volkswagen specific procedures. I have a kit to fine-tune the injector pump timing, which is regular Volkswagen stuff. And I also have custom 3D printed gizmos which are required because this engine doesn't have a Volkswagen flywheel on it. And there are no special tools to time an older engine like this one without the correct Volkswagen flywheel. Anyway, this is the crank lock and it holds the engine at top dead center to install the timing belt. This guy had to be custom 3D printed because the commonly available crank locks won't work on this engine. So I engineered my own. This guy is the crank pointer and it's used to fine-tune the injector pump timing. I realize it's not perfect, but it's better than guessing. Anyway, I found that it's significantly easier to time this engine when it's out of the truck, especially setting the injector pump timing. That's a real pain to do. As I recall, it took 4 hours last time I fiddled with the pump timing. When this engine's in the truck, fiddling with the injector pump is not easy. Fast forward a day or so and the engine's back in the truck and it's running again. The truck's been running for well over 2 hours. Previously, I've run this engine at idle for over an hour, but I've never checked the oil pressure. And it wasn't until I permanently installed the oil pressure gauge that I discovered the engine was losing oil pressure at idle. So this time around, I'm keeping an eye on the gauges, and I'm happy to say that the engine actually has oil pressure at idle. Let's take a look. So at idle, it's developing 28 psi, and when I goose the idle, we get a lot more pressure. Very nice. Now keep in mind, this engine's always had good oil pressure when it was cold, but apparently as it warms up the pressure would just gradually drop to zero. More than likely, a fresh set of main and rod bearings would further improve the oil pressure. But I don't see a reason to rebuild this engine at this time. Now if this engine was going to be permanently installed in the truck, then sure, a rebuild would be justified. However, the plan was always just to use the engine to get the project finished and then at some point upgrade to a more powerful version of this engine. Swapping engines in and out of this truck is not very difficult, and this project's always been focused on various engines that we can use in this platform. Anyway, with this smaller and less powerful engine, we have the opportunity to gather all sorts of data. We'll start with the simple normally aspirated diesel engine and work our way up with a turbo, and eventually we'll find the right combination of parts to finish this epic build. Well, I reckon I need to finish putting this thing back together so we can once again start doing our road testing. Hopefully, we've seen the last of the major problems and this truck will start accumulating some more miles. Thanks for hanging out with me today, and we'll see you next time. Until then.